All right, let's get started. So, hello and welcome to the launch event for Inee's new report and policy paper, Mind the Gap and Closing the Gap. I'm Lauren Gherkin, the Inee Gender Coordinator, and I'm so excited to see how many people have tuned into the launch today. Before we get started, we just have a few quick reminders for participants. Next slide, please. So you are all muted and your video has been disabled. You won't be able to unmute yourself to ask questions, but we do encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A function at any time. You can see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you do have a specific question for a presenter, please include their name in your question. Closed captioning for this webinar is available in English, and you can select it by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be shared on the Inee website after the webinar. Please share them with your colleagues who are unable to attend today. Next slide, please. So let's get started. We have a number of great speakers for you today who will introduce you to the content of the report and the policy paper, share some key findings and recommendations, and delve into some of the case studies that informed the report. But to really understand those findings and recommendations, we first need to understand the context in which the report was developed. Next slide, please. So, to situate the report in the wider gender and EIE landscape, we'll hear first from Kathleen Flynn Dappa, Director of Education, Gender-Based Violence, and Child Protection for Global Affairs Canada, then from Emma Spicer, Head of the Girls Education Department for FCDO, and then from my colleague Laura Davison, the Thematic Areas Team Lead for Inee. Thank you all for joining us today, for taking time to speak with us, and I will hand off now to Kathleen. Next slide, please.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm so pleased to see so many people on the line today. This month, as many of you know, we celebrate the 3-year anniversary of the Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education, a commitment that galvanized a historic 3.8 billion Canadian dollar investment under Canada's G7 leadership to improve access to girls' and women's education and skills training in fragile, crisis, and conflict-affected settings, including for refugees and displaced populations. And in that declaration, we recognize the importance of data and that improving data is a partnership. And that is why part of the declaration recognizes that, and in support of those objectives in the declaration, Canada is working with data partners, including the Inee, to improve the collection, monitoring, analysis, and publication and reporting of data to improve access for this population. And this report that we'll be looking at today, Mind the Gap, the State of Girls' Education in Crisis and Conflict, is one of several pieces that we are supporting with Inee to improve the accountability and transparency and the data and evidence base for education for girls in crisis and conflict situations. But as many of us know, the gains in improved access are at risk of being lost under the current global crisis. COVID-19 has already brought the reality of 69 million out-of-school girls in crisis-affected settings as of 2019 to the forefront. It has made it so that up to 20 million girls are at risk of permanently dropping out of school in the next year, based on projections from different organizations, including the Malala Fund. And I think for many of us who are parents around the world, it has created an empathy within us to understand just the significance of educational disruption. We're at a key moment in history to reflect, assess, and take evidence-based action. And that's why we're pleased to support the Mind the Gap report that amplifies this evidence base on girls' education and the accompanying policy paper, Closing the Gap. This report is serving almost as a baseline of the state of girls' education in conflict and crisis prior to the impacts that will be seen from that $3.8 billion investment, which are now operational around the world. Framed in the context of the Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education, the report and the accompanying policy paper summarize recent progress made They point to gaps and the need to shift to a nexus approach between the humanitarian space and the development space. It outlines recommendations for actions, and it contributes to the evidence base on education for girls and women in crisis and conflict situations. We in Canada are continuing to prioritize these commitments we made 3 years ago. Our own work in this space is sustained not only by bilateral programs, over 55 projects that we've been supporting through our Charlevoix funding, but also through our funding to Education Cannot Wait and the Global Partnership to Education, where we just renewed our pledge at the G7 a little over a week ago. In February, we also launched the Together for Learning campaign to promote quality education and lifelong learning for refugee, other forcibly displaced, and host community children and youth. And this is an effort that will go for 3 years to the next Global Refugee Forum, and one where we hope we will continue to work closely with all of you as partners to really make a significant change in the lives of refugees and forcibly displaced children and youth. And together with G7 partners, we have reaffirmed our commitment to deepen our efforts towards gender equality in education, including in crisis and conflict settings. Indeed, the forward of this report was co-authored by Canada's Minister for International Development, Karina Gould, and the UK's Minister for the European Neighbourhood and the Americas, Wendy Morton, who's responsible for girls' education. And it demonstrates our commitment to girls' education at the highest level. As many of you know, the UK has made this a priority, and it's why I'm so pleased right now to turn the floor over to Emma Spicer, who is the head of FCAO's Girls' Education Department, so she can share how the UK's current G7 presidency is building on the progress made to date and is aiming to accelerate the work that we are doing collectively. So over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Kathleen, for that really gracious introduction. I'm actually really excited to be here today. I read the report in one sitting. And I read a lot of reports, but I think this is a really high quality report and is going to be a repository of evidence as we go forward. And I just want to congratulate Global Affairs Canada for commissioning it as part of the accountability work that came out of Charlevoix. And as Kathleen said, we've tried to do a bit of a double act with Canada in our G7 so we could build on the progress that was made at Charlevoix and take that progress forward, particularly for the most vulnerable girls and boys and those who are on the move around the world. And I was quite seized this morning when I read something in the newspapers that reminded me this is the 9th consecutive year that numbers of displaced people around the world have been rising. So I think it's just telling us how timely this report is. And I think the report's done a really good job, not just in bringing forward the data, and I do want to congratulate the authors. So I think it's Ruth, Seb and Amy, but I really do want to congratulate the authors, not only in bringing together the evidence base, but also for bringing these great stories that really bring the report to life. And that's why our Minister Morton, was so thrilled to help write the foreword with Karina Gould. Now, what you'll probably be looking for me to do is to tell you not only what our takeaways are, but what our do's are at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in relation to the report. So I've had a quick think about that with colleagues, and I did want to give you some do commitments in response to the report, and I think these are things that we can discuss in the upcoming discussions. So as I've said, we used our G7 presidency to respond exactly as Kathleen has said to the pressing condition facing girls' education at the moment, and we've come up with 2 global commitments around access to learning, access to school and to learning. And the idea is to get all kids back into school and then some, so we reduce the big stock of out-of-school children. And of course, that's precisely the children who are in scope for your review. But in terms of do's and things that we need to do, when the ex-DFID and our Foreign Office came together, we've got a new lever for action, and that's going to be on human rights. So we were really taken by the piece at the beginning of the report about the need to tighten up on national laws and international frameworks that protect people and guarantee girls' rights to at least 9 years of compulsory education. So that's one do that you can put down to us. We will be reviving that discussion at national, international level if we can. And I think as part of that, we really want to formally recognise alternative education and start counting that in the data on enrolment, because obviously, you know, if you're not counting something, it doesn't count. The next do, which struck me, and it really came out strongly in the report, is the multifaceted nature of violence against girls, from everything ranging from sex brigades to, you know, terrorism, deliberate terrorism on schools and kidnapping girls. So, I mean, the takeaway for us there is just more on mainstreaming in our bilateral programs, and then more on supporting international action on things like the Safe School Declaration and those other international initiatives like the Safe to Learn. And there's also the End Violence campaign. So that was another do for us. I will hurry up because I know you want to get onto the juicy stuff of the report. The next one that we need to do more with, and we're really shoulder to shoulder with Canada on this, is the whole data piece, which is the subject of this report. So we've got missing data around enrolment, missing data around learning, and everybody deserves to learn. We've got missing data around violence in schools, particularly at the personal level. And then, of course, we've got gaps in tracking international flows for education. And we really need to, certainly in my own organisation, we need to code education properly so it turns up in the international data as exactly what it is, supporting education. The last thing that I wanted to, and then I'll end, talk about is the statistics on humanitarian appeals. Because ask families what they care about in emergency settings, they say educating their children. Look at the state of global humanitarian appeals, and education is often neglected. And what was really interesting in the report was the disparity of where a report is relatively more successful than another humanitarian appeal. So, for example, poor DRC never gets helped out. So ECW is doing a good job of getting more funding behind these appeals, but boy, do we need to do better. So I'm going to end there just to really congratulate everybody involved in this report. I really think because it makes such a strong play on the evidence, it gives us more focus for action, and that's what we all need. So thanks very much for inviting me today, and yeah, thank you again.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thank you, Kathleen, as well, for your support for this publication. And thanks for setting the scene and putting this report into its broader context in terms of the landscape of girls' education in crisis-affected contexts. We sincerely appreciate you both taking the time to prioritize this launch and for joining Inee in highlighting the progress as well as the gaps in girls' education in emergencies and protracted crises. And a warm welcome again from the Inee Secretariat to all who've joined to listen in this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you're calling in from. I'm really excited about these two publications that Inee has recently published with the support of Global Affairs Canada. The comprehensive report, Mind the Gap, represents a milestone in documenting the state of girls' education in crisis-affected countries. And this is a population that is explicitly referenced in the Charlevoix Declaration, with a commitment to reducing the time children are out of school. Indeed, our report shows that out of 130 million girls out of school worldwide, the majority, or 54%, live in crisis-affected countries. And our policy paper, Closing the Gap, summarizes the key findings of the report and outlines some recommendations on the way forward. I'd also like to join Emma in taking this opportunity to thank the authors, Ruth, Sebastian, and Amy, for developing this report. And I'd also like to thank the Inee Girls Education in Emergencies Reference Group members for reviewing and feeding into drafts of this report. This collaboration led to the development of a comprehensive quality report vetted and reviewed by multiple agencies with significant input from many individuals. I won't list them all now, but you know who you are, and we appreciate your efforts to make this happen. Indeed, everything that Inee develops is a collaborative effort, and I want to acknowledge the collaboration that it requires to bring a report like this to publication. Our hope at Inee is that these two publications will be read, referenced, discussed, shared, and that they can be used by practitioners and policymakers, as well as donors, to advocate for the right to education for girls in crisis-affected contexts and close that gap for girls once and for all. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Ruth Naylor, our lead author and principal consultant at the Education Development Trust, and co-author Sebastian Hein, program specialist at UNESCO IET, to take us through the report. Over to you both.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for those introductions, and thank you everyone for joining this call. It's great to see you all here. So this, focusing on Mind the Gap, what is it? It's a global monitoring report, if you like, a state of where it is and what progress have we made. It is very much serving as a baseline for the Charlevoix Declaration. The Charlevoix Declaration brought together a sort of a movement in policy around girls' education and a movement in policy around education in crisis, but actually brought that together to girls' education and women's education in crisis and conflict. And so it was bringing together these two areas, and we need to say, well, what was the state of that? And while this is already 3 years on, this is actually forms quite a baseline report. If we look at the international data, once you get data of the quality for comparing, we're looking at 2018-19 data in there. And if we look at the programming, our case studies of programming that has impact, we're still not yet really able to look at the programming from the Charlevoix Declaration, from the programs generated from that. So we're looking at existing programming that was going on at the time. So I think we could see this report very much as a baseline, charting the journey to where we've come, but as a baseline to see how we can progress. Now there is this international real push towards getting girls and women into education and training in contexts of crisis and refugee and IDP populations. Can we have the next slide, please? So it's the methodology, it's not a comprehensive review of all the research of girls' education in crisis. It brought together recent research. It brought together a set of case studies on girls' education, and it brought together the statistics, and it also reviewed the law and the policy environment around girls' education in crises. But because of the old data issue, it doesn't really, we can't really say what's happened as a result of COVID. It doesn't cover COVID in depth. We did include a policy review to look at plans and policies as part of the COVID-19 response. And what we found was, sadly, a lot of them just didn't take girls' needs into account. There was a lot of reliance on ed tech that just didn't take into account the gender digital divide. There was very little attention paid to the safeguarding and protection needs of girls once the protective effect of schools is effectively lost to them. Once schools are closed and they're at home, there was not much explicit planning to address that. Okay, if we can go on to the next. And that protection element really forms a bit of a core theme to the report, because it's this intersection between education, protection, and gender that makes girls' education and women's education in conflict and crisis contexts so vitally important, and something that you need to reduce that gap of being out of school as much as you can. And in the school closure context we've had under COVID, that you need to make contingency plans to cover for what happens when the protective effect of schooling is suddenly withdrawn. So there's very strong evidence of a wonderful virtuous cycle where a girl gets education and that protects her. It gives her the skills she needs to protect herself. It protects her from early marriage, from unwanted pregnancy. It can help her protect herself in so many ways. And it also helps those girls protect their society, their families and their society, their children. There's strong evidence showing that once girls are educated, it makes their communities much more resilient to future crises, more resilient to drought, more resilient to flooding, and millions of lives could be saved by educating girls. But on the flip side of that, there is a vicious cycle. And that's what happened when a girl loses access to school. She loses access to the protection it gives. And then if she's lost the protection it gives, that can lead to child marriage or violence or unwanted pregnancy, which then, once school resumes or opportunities for education resume, make it so much harder for her to get back into school, and leaves her society vulnerable to future crises. So keeping girls in school as soon as possible when the crisis occurs is really vital, and keeping that link between protection and education. If we go on to the next slide. Now, while it is definitely safer for a girl to be in school than not in school, sadly, we found in this report that many girls who do go to school are still not safe. In crisis and conflict-affected countries in particular, there appears to be a very high prevalence of school-related gender-based violence. Now, we can't give very strong estimates of global prevalence or comparative estimates either. But we know, for example, if you look at DHS survey data, if you ask women if they experienced rape when they were at school, there are millions of women living in Africa today who were raped by their teachers when they were at school. Also, studies have found that in many countries, sex for grades or sex for promotion is common practice, and everyone knows about it and is talking about it. We just don't have actual grades or actual data on how often it occurs, partly because the legislation and the identification, the actual arresting the perpetrators is so poorly carried out. So girls are under danger from those within their school. They're also in danger from those outside the school, from military groups, from terrorists, from those attacking education. And we know that from the great work that GCPEA does, recording attacks on education, in most countries there are gender-targeted attacks where girls are explicitly targeted because of their gender. And it's not all attacks, but in many cases. So I'm going to hand over, these are where areas we can't give strong statistics, but I'm going to hand over to Sebastian, who'll talk a bit more about the global statistics.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. I should clarify, I'm at IIEP now, but I was part of the Education Development Trust when we carried out the research for this. So this just shows you where we identified crisis-affected countries, and that was these countries were identified based on numbers of humanitarian appeals they'd had in recent years and proportion of the population that is forcibly displaced. You can see more details on that in the report, but we can go to the next slide. Yeah, data was a challenge, but these are some of the key findings we found. So 54% of the world's out-of-school girls are in these 44 crisis-affected countries. So, more than half are in crisis-affected countries. Girls are way off track to meet, one of the minimum targets for the SDGs. So, they'll only be completing lower secondary in these countries by 2063 at the earliest. But it's more complex than that. So this graph on the right, you don't need to look at the individual countries, but just at the overall shape. So the orange bars are countries where girls are behind boys in enrollment in the final year of lower secondary. So that's a proxy for completing those 9 years of school. But there are a lot of countries where girls outperform boys, so those countries in blue. And some of those are countries you wouldn't have expected and wouldn't have been there 10, 15, 20 years ago. So, at the very bottom you have Bangladesh, where girls outperform boys there by 15 percentage points, which is significant. So it's not the case that girls are always behind. And there is a bit of a geographic split, so a lot more of those countries in blue where girls do better on this metric are either in Latin America or Francophone Africa, it seems. Yeah. Next slide. So a lot of the stats we had were at the national level, but there were cases where we looked within countries at some of the inequalities within countries. And where you're able to do that depends a lot on the quality of data. So Ethiopia is an interesting one because you can look at gross enrollment for, by gender for, the national average, but also for refugees and IDPs. We had a good look, and there's really very few countries where you could do this kind of analysis. So at the national level, if we're looking at primary, highlighted in red, boys are outperforming girls, but you have high enrollment rates for both. In the middle, you have refugees, where there's this huge gap, actually. Boys are far outperforming girls in enrollment. And there's a similar large gap, not as big for refugees, but there's a similar large gap for IDPs. So within countries, you can have very large inequalities between groups that are hidden at the national level statistics. And I think if you look through the report, there's a really interesting set of data we looked at in the what's it called? The Lake Chad Basin region. So we looked at the crisis-affected regions of Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon, and compared those with national averages in those 4 countries. And you find out the inequalities are really quite stark in those crisis-affected regions for girls. And there's plenty more examples in the report. Next slide. Yes, and this was something Emma picked up on earlier. Aid for girls' education and how we track that is quite complex. So the first graph on the left shows the proportion of development aid by levels of education that is targeting gender equality and women's empowerment. And you can see this has risen steadily over the last 10 years. And this is for those 44 crisis-affected countries. What you can't tell from this is what proportion of this is going to crisis situations within these countries. Crises affect different parts of countries, and it's not often they affect the whole country until this last year. But on the right, we can't do the same analysis for humanitarian aid. So we just don't know how much humanitarian aid for education is going towards gender equality and women's empowerment. So that's me. I'll hand over to the next speaker, and happy to answer any questions in the chat or Q&A.
Thanks, Sebastian. And yeah, Sebastian's done a great job of crunching huge sets of numbers to find the differences and also the nuances. And overall, the story, if you look back over recent decades, it is a positive one. We have to recognize the progress that's been made. The gender gap in access is closing, or perhaps I should say was closing. We still don't know the gendered impact of COVID. and it could be a massive setback for girls in these crisis contexts. I've seen there are extrapolations of the 20 million girls, but also for refugees, it's estimated that maybe half of refugees, female refugees who are currently going to school, might not return after COVID. So there has been great progress. And there's been great progress in the legal barriers as well. Even in recent years, we've seen bans lifted on pregnant girls and young mothers attending school in many countries. Only 3 countries still have an outright legal ban. And there's been a big progress in refugee laws as well, and legal restrictions. An example for the Rohingya refugees, they were formally allowed access to formal education. So the legal barriers are slowly dismantling. In aid, we are seeing an increased proportion. It's still pitifully small, but it's increasing humanitarian aid to education. And we're seeing this strong drive in gender with overall aid to education in conflict-affected countries, especially in the secondary education area, a real focus. And if you look at the big multilateral agencies funding education in these countries, they're developed or developing very strong gender strategies and action plans, and incorporating gender into their results frameworks, and new dedicated funds forming. So there's a lot of progress going on. And I think probably partly because of those new results frameworks, but we are seeing great improvements in sex and age disaggregated data in reporting. 5 years ago, I was looking for sex disaggregated data on IDPs and refugees, and you just couldn't find anything. A lot of what's in this report wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. So gaps remain, but huge progress has been made, and we should acknowledge that. So if we go to the next slide. So acknowledging there are big gaps, but acknowledging there's been big progress, but there's large gaps remaining. And the report sort of separates these out into provision gaps, funding gaps, and data gaps. And the provision gaps are two-sided. It's what the international community can do, and what national policies and laws can change. So I think Laura's going to talk later about the implications for planning and policy. But at the level of provision, we're still seeing large gender gaps, especially among the poorest, especially among refugees and IDPs. And we think among people with disabilities. We don't have a full picture with children with disabilities, but there's strong evidence that the gender gaps are worse. While overall the gender gap is closing across those crisis and conflict affected countries, those 44 countries, it seems to be getting worse among refugees. IDPs, the data isn't strong enough, but it does seem to indicate that it's often worse among displaced groups. And there are clearly protection gaps. Too many situations where girls are not safe from other students and from teachers, and not safe from external attack. In terms of funding, the humanitarian aid remains too little, but almost worse, it's just too unpredictable. Countries don't know whether they're going to be funded from one year to the next. And you can't run an education program on 6-month funding cycles. It takes longer than 6 months to educate a girl. We also found it was surprisingly hard to find case studies of dedicated girls' education programs, or even programs that had strong gender responsive elements focused on girls. And as I said, this is a baseline. We're not yet seeing the programming impact from Charlevoix, but it appeared that there wasn't enough dedicated funding to girls' education in crises that you need, especially in contexts like refugee and IDP camps, where just gender responsive programming is still not going to reach enough girls. You need to have programs especially for girls. And there's an aid transparency gap. We actually still don't know how much aid goes to education for girls and women in contexts of crisis, that we can't track it as it stands. And that's the sort of financial data gap, but we still have gaps on intersecting vulnerabilities. As I said, we think the gender gaps are worse among children with disabilities. We don't have a big enough data set. I seem to spend my life reading reports on girls' education, looking for statistics disaggregated by disability. And then I go to the disability reports and look for statistics disaggregated by sex. And I can't find where the two intersect. IDPs, we're missing a lot of data. Ethiopia's done a great job in collecting that data. And we're still missing a lot of that. We are missing, I've not put it on the slide, but data on learning is still very, very patchy in crisis situations. And data on gender-based violence in schools, our data is not yet reliable enough to track it, to monitor it, to see, is it getting better? We can only just say it's bad at the moment. So that remains a big gap. So big improvements in data, but still big areas where we can't properly monitor how things are progressing. And now I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful case studies, which is really where a lot of the richness of the report came from. And I'd just like to thank all of those who contributed to the case studies. But I'll hand over to our case studies now.
Thanks. We're actually going to quickly go over some of the recommendations for
Okay,
closing the gap first, but no worries. So thank you both to Ruth and Sebastian for that comprehensive overview of the Mind the Gap report. I already see lots of really interesting questions on the report coming through the Q&A. Please do keep them coming, and we'll do our best to answer them all at the end of the webinar. So could you go to the next slide, please? For anyone who joined a bit late, my name again is Lauren Gherkin, and I'm the Inee Gender Coordinator, and I'm going to present some of the recommendations coming out of the Closing the Gap policy paper. Next slide, please. So Closing the Gap presents several recommendations around programming, policy, funding, and data to ensure that those gaps that Ruth just highlighted are addressed. We've noted a few of them for you here, but we really recommend that you check out the policy paper for a more comprehensive list and a bit more context around these recommendations. But to give you a brief overview, the programming and policy recommendations are really centered around ensuring that all programs at all stages are gender responsive, that they ensure that girls' rights are protected, and they take into account the unique challenges that girls face in accessing education during and following crises. It's critical that the international community, civil society, and governments work together to ensure that girls are continuing to learn during crises, that they have access to certified education, be it through formal schooling or alternative programs, that they're safe in and around schools, and that additional support is provided for the most marginalized girls. The paper highlights that greater attention needs to be paid to removing the structural barriers to education for girls, including girls who are pregnant and parenting, ensuring that refugee education policies include explicit strategies to support girls to access education and to make sure that they're learning when they are in schools, and around developing and strengthening legal frameworks and safeguarding systems to prevent violence in schools and protect girls' rights. Next slide, please. On funding, the policy paper highlights the need for more and longer-term funding for education and emergencies broadly, but particularly for girls in contexts where they remain significantly behind boys in access to education and in terms of learning outcomes. Other key recommendations are around promoting transparency and better tracking of funding for girls' EIE. Some recommendations include making the gender marker for humanitarian funding to education mandatory and including data in the UN OCHA financial tracking service, or revising the OECD creditor reporting system. These changes would make it much easier to see how much funding is going to girls' EIE across the humanitarian development nexus and make it clearer where gaps exist and more funding is needed. Finally, data recommendations focus on the need for more and better data on girls' education in crisis contexts, as well as capacity building to collect and analyze that data. EIE programs should collect and publish data on learning outcomes for girls and boys, disaggregated by sex, age, and disability, and government should be supported to include crisis-affected populations in national learning assessments, and again, disaggregate data by sex, age, disability, and displacement status. And finally, the international community should continue to support and invest in coordinated monitoring of school-related gender-based violence and attacks on schools, so we can know more about how to make girls safe when they're in schools or on the way to school. Again, please do check out the policy paper for a more comprehensive list of recommendations. We really hope that you'll read and you'll share. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass off to another member of the amazing team that developed the Mind the Gap report. Amy West is the Senior International Technical Advisor for Youth and Communications for Education Development Center, and she'll introduce and moderate a discussion around the case studies that informed the report and the policy paper. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I as well will say that during the production of the report, I was with the team from Education Development Trust. So thank you all. I'm very privileged to be moderating this portion of the webinar, and I would like to ask my distinguished colleagues from BRAC, CARE, and Norwegian Refugee Council to join me on video. And I will get to introductions in just a minute. But first, I wanted to give a little bit of a background to kind of how we chose the case studies and how they were developed. So as Sebastian mentioned earlier, we identified 44 crisis-affected countries. And from these, we looked at how we could select case studies to inform the report. We were looking for a balance between new emergencies, sudden onset emergencies, and protracted emergencies, a mixture of conflict, natural disaster, complex emergencies, and also highlighting displaced populations and refugee populations. We wanted the countries to be representative of the different regions in the world, and organizations, working with organizations that had been implementing girls' education programs since around the time of Charlevoix to present day. We wanted some sense of scale, and that could mean scale within communities, scale at national level, or scale at a regional level, and interventions that covered the range of education. So early childhood education, basic education, technical vocational education and training, and non-formal education programs. The case studies were very much a collaboration with the different organizations working on the ground. And as such, we were able to work with them to acquire participant quotations in terms of participant experiences, as well as access program level data that may not be published yet, but were part of what was being collected by monitoring and evaluation on the ground. The case studies really were meant to ground truth, the overall statistics and data that we were finding, and provide a contextual backdrop to the report, a more kind of personal and intimate look at the relationship between education and protection for girls in emergencies, and the realities of the organizations that were designing and delivering programs every day on the ground. So while there are gaps in evidence, we believe the case studies provide a critical reflection on the reality of education interventions and how specifically for girls these are being developed, implemented, evaluated, and funded. And I should mention that we wound up with 8 case studies. And we're just giving you kind of a little slice of this with 3 of our colleagues today. So I will have our panelists introduce themselves. I would like to have them do one by one with the first question. So we'll start with Fabio Mancini from Norwegian Refugee Council. If you could briefly describe your program, where you were working, the populations you were serving, and the approach for girls' education, that would be great. Fabio, over to you.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning or good evening, distinguished colleague. My name, as Amy said, is Fabio Mancini. I'm working as education specialist for Norwegian Refugee Council, and I will just give highlight of the program that is featured in the report, and actually it's a program that we are currently implementing. Going to the next slide, please. So the program, the overall objective of the program is really ensure that youth are enhancing their well-being and also enhance the resilience of youth actors. This is done by implementing different activities mainly in camp setting, targeting Syrian refugees aged between 16 and 32 years old. The project is, as I said, is ongoing, and it's ongoing in Zatari camp and Asra camp in Jordan. Next slide, please. So I think it's quite important to really underline and highlight why we are working with young people in Jordan. And as you can see from the slide here, there are several reasons. One is the demographic bulge, but also the high unemployment rate, that looking at girls specifically, if, as you can see from the screen, Syrian unemployment is 57% in host communities, and with a 93% females. And there is a very clear, it's clear, and we can see the different limitations and difficulties that really youth, refugees in general, especially girls, are really facing in accessing learning, but consequently also livelihood opportunities. This is due also the lack of services, and services obviously we are referring to, as mentioned, to vocational learning opportunities, but also life skills and recreational activities that allow really to look and support youth in a holistic manner. Finally, also the low participation in formal schools is really evident, with a negative impact on future opportunities. Next slide, please. Therefore, what we propose and we are proposing is a program that really look at the different needs of youth, but also the different needs of girls, and supporting them to transition toward the different opportunities, social engagement, livelihood, and also higher education opportunities. And this is done through a specific approach that first look at building the skills among male and female youth, Second is to support them to really apply these skills. Is what we call is the level 2 is the transition, and then working toward independent application of skills. As I said, and I conclude by saying that the way that NRC approach girls' education, engagement of girls in our program, it's a very holistic approach, because we are looking at a different level. We are also looking a lot at the well-being aspect, because we believe that it's a foundational aspect to consider, to develop the personal, social, and the emotional aspect, consider as foundational component for future opportunities. Thank you. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Fabio. That's great. We're moving around the world today. So our next panelist, Abdulfarhan Gure, will speak to us about the case study from Somalia. Abdulfarhan.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Abdulfarhan. I manage one of the 2 Girls Education Challenge projects implemented by CARE International in Somalia. And this project is called the Somali Girls Education Promotion Project, which is SOMJEP, and it's been implemented over the last 8 years. Started in 2013. The first phase ended in 2017. The second phase is continuing in now and started in 2017. The overall goal for this project is to increase learning and transition for most marginalized girls in rural and remote areas of Somaliland, Puntland, and Galmudug regions of Somalia. And these are mainly pastoralist girls. And looking at the data from the schools and the communities we work with in the peri-urban areas where girls, where these project locations are, they are up to about 16% of girls, of the girls in school describing themselves as pastoralists. In the most rural and remote areas, up to 60% of the girls' population in school are from pastoralist communities. And therefore today I will be speaking more about the pastoralist girls. So the second phase of the project is funded by, as I explained, FCDO, through the Girls Education Challenge of up to £14 million, with an additional contribution from the USAID. We are reaching about slightly over 27,000 girls. 56% on average of these girls are rural and pastoralists, and pastoralist dropout communities who have settled recently because of the drought and displacement and formed displacement camps, reaching about 7,800 of the girls' population. 16,000 of these 27,000 girls were enrolled in school already from the phase 1 of the project, and the additional number is in the phase 2. The approach that we use in this project is varied, but we have specific focus on social norm change for improved access to learning outcomes, learning outcomes, and transitions for girls. And we work with the communities, we work with girls themselves, and we work with the Ministry of Education, specifically the Gender Department and the Teacher Training and Quality Assurance Department, make sure that we are able to reach these girls in a sustainable manner. So I will stop there. Maybe I will continue from the next slide.
Great.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. We'll move now to Bangladesh and the Rohingya population. Kuri Chilam.
Thank you very much, Amy. At first, I want to thank Inee for choosing our case study and giving us this platform to share our experience. Next slide, please. Okay. Humanitarian Play Lab, before I start talking about this project, this is very important that I share a little bit about the background, how it all started, so that you understand the context a little bit more. In 2017, August, when about 1 million of Rohingya community fled from their country, from Myanmar to Bangladesh, they created this largest settlement of displaced population in this country. And among these people, about 85% were women and children. And BRAC from the day one stood beside them and started to provide the assistance and support that they required or needed. And Humanitarian Play Lab is an intervention or a model that actually focuses on the children of 0 to 6-year-old age and their parents and caregivers. And Humanitarian Play Lab is, it has two different approaches, and two elements are integrated with this. The first one is, it is a play-based intervention where curriculum is very much focused on play. And then psychosocial support for the parents and children are inbuilt so that we can actually provide support so that they can come out of the trauma that they have had facing the atrocities or the violences from their country. And it also expanded employability opportunity for a huge number of Rohingya women and girls, which I will be discussing further later. And in 2018 December, we embarked in this interesting and exciting partnership with Sesame Workshop, IRC, and New York University with Lego Foundation, which we are calling Play to Learn, so that we can expand this model further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kori. So I'm going to play a little bit with the questions with our panelists, but Kori, if you could stay on actually, and would you be able to speak to us about, in terms of your interventions, what worked well, what did you learn, what kept girls engaged in the learning, and kind of weave in the contextual challenges to that question?
Sure, Amy. So as we started working with them, with the community, we actually found out that one of our challenge was that the deep-rooted patriarchal mindset that the people had. So due to that, actually, girls' education was not prioritized. And in terms of that, what we did is we started working with the community, and then we tried to understand that how we can actually engage the parents so that the community people and the parents understand that girls' education is important, and they would let the girls come into the centers that we have for 2 to 6-year-old children. And what we did is actually, in order to address that, we started working with the community people. We actually designed this entire intervention, keeping them with our side. So we conducted several meetings, community awareness programs, and then we also had material development workshops where actually we tried to integrate their cultural elements. And as I'm talking about cultural elements, I want to share that our HPL curriculum, or Humanitarian Play Lab curriculum, is heavily based on the culture and the practices of the people that they have. So we have integrated the cultural elements so that people are proud of what they're doing, and then the people are transferring the knowledge that they want their children to learn and know about of them. And we have addressed all these things, and not only that, while we actually designed the sessions, we kept the community people with us, and while doing so, we tried to encourage our play leaders, who happen to be Rohingya girls, our play leaders who are the frontline workers. We encourage them so that they create opportunities for the girls, so that the girls' confidence are boosted, and then the girls take charge of the activities where boys and other children would actually follow the girl, or understand that, okay, it is okay that with them, it is also possible that their other classmates can also take part of that activity and conduct, and they would be able to follow. So these are some of the things that we have actually addressed through our curriculum.
Thank you so much, Kori. Abdifarhan, can you please talk to us a little bit about what kept pastoralist girls engaged in learning, and maybe provide a little bit further contextual background to some of the challenges, but how you address those, and maybe what recommendations you would have for others working with such populations?
Thank you. So if I start with the challenges, the main challenge for pastoralist girls is displacement due to drought. And when there is a drought, there is also resource-based conflict and causes insecurity. And all this contributes to girls either dropping out temporarily out of school or permanently moving out of where the location where the school has been and moving to areas where there isn't school or outside where you can track them. So in this, in the last few years, we've been doing longitudinal tracking of the girls we work with, and we were establishing where these girls, what are the main challenges that they face. And the main challenge is girls moving or migrating from one location to another, or even moving away from their homes into small towns, small villages, and working as maids or, getting involved in small business and therefore not being able to continue with education. In terms of insecurity, it affects girls, but also affects the entire school community. There are situations where, because of armed conflicts, schools remain closed for 2-3 years. Sometimes the school is used, there are cases where schools are used as military bases. Furniture is destroyed, and by the time the conflict is over, it takes another half a year or X number of months to restart education in that kind of situation. So what we do is basically we are able to support communities restart their schools after a conflict. During the drought, we had the opportunity to do some crisis modifiers like water tracking, and the school is used as it's basically in remote and rural areas, basically the main infrastructure available to the whole community. So the school water tank is where the water tracking is done for the whole community. So the school shares with the rest of the community during the drought. This enables girls and children stay in school during the drought. Apart from the project itself doing some crisis modification, we are able also to leverage emergencies programming from other care projects and provide food and provide cash, so that the communities where the girls we have been working with are targeted for their emergency programming. In most cases, girls are displaced, and we establish accelerated basic education classes for newly displaced pastoralist communities, and therefore they're older and they're able to accelerate the first few years of learning and then rejoin formal education. We also have a program which is tailor-made for older girls who have dropped out of school, either due to early marriage or for other reasons, and they're able to get back into school and learn literacy, numeracy, also get some financial and life skills training, and these ones get into different pathways, either back to school or go and start a small-scale business, or basically improve their livelihoods. So these are some of the opportunities that we use to give a second chance to older girls, so they're able to continue with education, apart from the usual bursaries and school fees and teacher trainings and school infrastructure improvement, provision of learning materials. But these are specifically the programs we do for the girls in this area.
Great, thank you so much. And last but not least, Fabio, if you could speak a little bit about how specifically you engaged adolescent girls and young women in the technical skills vocational training in Jordan, and what you might recommend for others, that would be great.
Absolutely, thank you for the question, Amy. I think the way our approach is really looking at the gender strategy every year in order to ensure that we are proposing attracting but also activities that can really retain girls and young women in education. So we look actually at different aspects also in this case, both in terms of content, learning space, but also community engagement. In terms of content, what we did, and I think it's something that I would like really to recommend. Also, sometimes we really need to think about girls' engagement in education and opportunities to also challenge sometimes a bit the social norms. Obviously, within a specific limitation, but really to challenge, to give other point of view, or to think outside the box. In fact, what we did, for example, we revised a bit the content related to a carpentry course, and now we have a group of girls that are really attending this course. The course is ongoing, and etc. And this is really a concrete example on how we can do or engage also girls in something that traditionally in different contexts it's not really appropriate in a sense. So in terms of learning space, we also try to guarantee, and we guarantee to really a proper safe environment where girls have really the opportunity also to freely share opinion, but also to propose new ideas to be implemented. And finally, also, as we know, the community engagement, as I said, really this challenging, but also discuss with the community about the importance of education for girls and young women is kind of foundation is very important. So we engage girls or volunteers, young women, to really to do outreach work, to invite also community members to other center to see to our center to see what we do and how really the youth are engaged in the activities. By looking at these different aspects, by revising our strategy, we are guaranteeing really that the proposed intervention is aligned with the needs, building the opportunities for girls and young women. Back to you, Amy.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all three of you for joining me today on this panel, and for giving us a little bit of travel around the world and a window into your realities. And thank you to all of the organizations who participated in the case study collaborations and building those stories out as part of our report. At this point, I'm going to ask our three panelists to stay on video, and I'm going to open the discussion to the questions from the audience for all panelists. So if all of the panelists and presenters can please come back on video, the more the merrier to join us. I believe we have some questions that appeared in the chat, so I'll start with those. If you have any further burning questions, please post them in the chat. Our first question that I see, I'm going to direct to Ruth and Sebastian. Through your research, was there anything that surprised you either from the evidence or data you uncovered?
I think the positives surprised me, how many countries had made you know, where there were more girls completing secondary than boys that were crisis affected. But then the areas where girls were behind, just how bad it was, and also just how hard it was to find those case studies, which I know you worked on, Amy. And we really struggled to find case studies with sex disaggregated data and that had clear strategies for girls' education. So sort of at a global level, I was surprised how positive it was, but where there were gaps, how neglected they were. I don't know if Sebastian, you've got anything to add?
No, just echoing that, you know, at the global level, you know, even national statistics can hide some of the inequalities within countries, and we showed an example of that in Ethiopia for refugees. But yeah, when you drill down sort of the intersecting inequalities, if you look at within a country, the crisis affected regions, the girls within those regions, and then if you add, you know, disabled girls or poor girls, then there are some groups for which progress really isn't happening at all in a lot of contexts, and those are the ones that we're obviously, you know, trying to highlight and address. So yeah, that's from me.
Great, thank you both. Our next question is going to be directed to Kathleen and Emma. And if Ruth or Sebastian, you would like to add to this, you're more than welcome. But we'll start with Kathleen and Emma. Is there any reason why more humanitarian aid is not dedicated to girls' education despite the gaps? And is this due to a lack of data or just not a priority for those affected countries? And what would be your advice to humanitarian actors to address this problem?
Okay, I think that's a challenging question and a very timely one. I know that I come more from the dev side of things, so I have to say it's almost a question that we ask ourselves on the development side of things. And I think what it really points to for us and for Canada is around this idea of a nexus approach. So what I hear from humanitarian colleagues in some respects, I mean, there are humanitarian principles and some of them are really important to how we operationalize our funding. And in the case of Canada, it's not necessarily that funding isn't flowing to education, it's that we give unearmarked funding. And I think there was another question in there too around some of the challenges in this space. And really the challenges for children are multi-sectoral. So when we fund UNICEF often does use some of that funding for education. They use it for protection, they use it for WASH, they use it for food security. It's a very multi-sectoral approach. And I think it's part of the challenge that we face in this space. There are some donors who have committed to like the EU committed to allocating a certain percentage of their education, of their humanitarian funding to education and emergencies. And they've used the DAC sector code and it makes it easy to track. In our case for Canada, we've taken this approach of an unearmarked funding. And that's why we're looking in the department more at nexus approaches. And we actually have a whole working group in our department because it is a department-wide commitment to do so. And we've tried to situate our campaign within that space. So part of what we would like to do in the next 3 years is actually dig into this question and look at what it means for the two sectors to kind of lean into one another so that children aren't falling into these gaps. And it does require, a different type of planning. I think there are many a few other questions in there too that, talk about. There's one that talked about sort of investing ahead for resilience, and I think that is a big part of what we want to do. I think that's a big part of what drove the Charlevoix commitment. I think, when you look at the Global Partnership for Education, where they're working in over, 65% of them are conflict affected. Part of what interests us in that is actually an investment into the education system. Some of our bilateral investments, in countries like Afghanistan, for example, they are about building the system there to create the resilience and to see education as a part of preventing us from getting into these situations. But I think collectively we agree that this gap that's come out is quite significant. And we do need to work differently going forward. Over.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. I think we may have lost Emma. Do I see Emma? Ruth or Sebastian, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's lack of data, but I think there is also a lack of is the girl focused. Things might be gender aware, at least, of collecting gendered data, but I think the barriers are just so huge that just sort of gender sensitive approaches aren't actually going to reach the most marginalized girls in those crisis situations. And I think it's partly this challenge of, do you work with the system, but if girls are already, so it's a nexus issue, do you work with the system, but girls are, if they're not getting into the system, making the schools better isn't going to help your 15-year-old girl with 2 kids. It's partly about providing alternative routes that are going to be more accessible for the girls. So it is about the ones who fall between the gaps. But I think if, and I say if, but also as more and more programs and funders insist on sex disaggregated data, hopefully we will see more programming to address those gaps. I think there is a bit of a data tail wagging the programming dog as well that we need.
I think there's also an interesting discussion around, advocacy and humanitarian aid to education. I think it's always around 2% of humanitarian aid goes to education, maybe up to 2.5%. But at national level, the Untitled Declaration says that governments should be spending 15 to 20% of their whole budget on education. I think the EU's made progress, so they've said they have a target, I think, of 10% of their aid should go to education, and there used to be an advocacy target of around 4%, I think, but 4% seems still really low. So I think there's an interesting discussion around should we be advocating a target for the proportion of humanitarian aid that should go to education, just to even start having a reasonable discussion. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, our next and final question, I believe, is around COVID-19. We all expected this one. And this goes to our case study presenters. So I'll give you a second to organize. How has COVID-19 affected and impacted your programs? Have you done anything to pivot or adapt your programming? And can you see the future? I'm sure this is going to be context specific to the countries you're working in, but do you see what the future of these programs are beyond the pandemic? And can you talk a little bit about that?
So let me go first. So when COVID came in, it was another level of a challenge for already a situation where the challenge of insecurity and the challenge of drought has led to lots of learning for children. So there were lockdowns and school closures, which led to substantial time lost for children. But again, there were opportunities that came in terms of rolling out digital learning opportunities for children through the Ministry of Education and different other programs, not only the program where we work in, including the GPE, rolling out radio and television programs. But again, working with rural communities, there is the digital divide already in terms of access to technology. And there was a need to adapt quickly or rapidly and make sure that children, even in rural areas, have access to this, either through the provision of technology like tablets, uploaded with content that's already available, or access to links for the television and radio programs, so they can be able to, or can be able to access this and use it for their teaching and learning. And therefore, what we learned from this is technology alone is not enough. There is need to have a blended approach for teaching and learning in such situations, where you continue providing the traditional access to learning materials, which teachers can use to provide or distribute to children, and children can use this to access learning. For instance, in our project, we were able to provide these materials and also tablets, and we had almost over 90% of the girls being able to respond and say we were able to have access to some form of learning while schools were closed and when we were at home. And out of these, about 50 or 49% of them said they spent at least 2 hours a day to be able to concentrate on some schoolwork, even with the increased household costs while they're at home. they are still able to have some form of learning going on. And therefore, it's very important that this technology is carried forward even after the schools have opened. For instance, the use of WhatsApp groups for teachers to share learning materials, to share experiences, and even keep in touch with each other, and keep in touch with school supervisors, and make sure this is something that can be used even for data collection, like how many children are in school. So some of the innovations, I'm sure, will go a long way even when schools come back to normality. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Fabio or Kuri?
Thank you, Amy. So during COVID, as you all know, that the mobility had been restricted, and especially in the camp situation where we need special permission to go there. So host community people, or we couldn't really go there. So during that time, what we did is that we had to think of alternative way, through which we can actually reach the people, because that is a very much low-tech area where people were only using basic phones and no access to internet connection or television or anything, so that we had to think of a way so that we can reach them through telephone at least. And from that, actually, what we did is, we know that top-down approach never works, and we work with the community and we try to understand what they need at that time, and we wanted to be beside them. And for that, we created a model which is known as Patriarchal, which provides PSS support, and it is also another play-based intervention where PSS and play is kind of integrated. And we reached our parents through it, and also children, and our frontline workers who are Rohingya mother volunteers and play leaders. We have provided them the capacity building training for how they can reach the mothers and beneficiaries and the children through telephone, and provide the support that the beneficiaries need at that time. So that is what we did for Patriarchal, and Patriarchal literally means beside you, and we wanted to be that. And also we created this system of care for our beneficiaries, so that anytime they can reach us through telephone. And this model is very much flexible, so that it could be transferred anytime, anywhere, in any modality. For example, we started off with telephone, but then again, later on, we also added a component of home visit, because when restriction mobility was lifted a little bit, in that time, our play leaders and mother volunteers went to the beneficiaries and met the children and the mothers, and we have collected data, and we saw that there was immense response from the parents and children to see their beloved play leaders and mother volunteers after a long time. So this is what we did during COVID. And then, if you, as you were asking, what kind of learning we will be taking from it, of course, the learning that we have had from COVID, we will be taking it into our program next. We found out that it is very important to be connected with the caregivers and parents in any program or any intervention. So that is something we would be taking in. And then in our future program designing, we would be including all these things. We would make sure that the system of care for psychosocial support is there as well, so that they have a place, or they have the safety network where they can go. So these are some of the major learnings that we have had. And these are the things that we would be looking at when we would be designing further programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I give the last word to Fabio, if you would like it.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. We did, so our approach was really twofold. One, on one side, we really started revising a bit the delivery approach, of course. So we moved to a blended, as Gur said, it was very similar, a blended approach, but also following our youth engaged in our program individually a bit more. But another thing that, sorry, I need to stress out this, because every time that we think about COVID-19, obviously, we think about the negative impact, but something that we did and something that I really strongly recommend, and I guess already different organizations are doing the same, is also to look at the positive mechanisms, right? That the community, the youth put it in place. What were the positive coping mechanisms that could be replicated? And we work a lot on digging on this, on find this and building. Just a few examples. We noticed among youth, especially among girls in camps, about the increased self-study skills, for example, or increased digital skills. At the same time, in camps, again, we noticed also how, unfortunately, but anyway, due to the setup, there was an increase in informal support network, community network, right, where students have been supported. Now, what we are trying to do is really to build on this positive coping mechanism and really integrate in the response. And I think this is something really that we really, as a community, education community, to really look a bit more, because there are so many positive things that happen and the skills that really youth in general, but girls and the example of self-study skills put it in place. Over, back to you, Amy.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful note to end on. I just want to thank again all of the panelists and presenters for such a lively discussion and overview of the report and the policy brief. I turn it back now to Lauren.
Thanks, Amy. And thank you so much to all of our wonderful presenters and participants today. Before we let you go, I just wanted to flag a few other new Inee resources on gender and education and emergencies. You can find the links I just posted in the chat. And if Andrew, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen again. So as you know, the Mind the Gap report and Closing the Gap paper are live on the Inee website now. Please do check them out. We've also developed an infographic with key statistics from the report, which we hope can be useful for you for advocacy and for information sharing. We also recently launched a new podcast series on girls' education and emergencies called Educate Us, Women and Girls on Learning in Humanitarian Crises. It features a range of stories and perspectives on women's and girls' education and emergencies, explores the gains that are made and the slip backwards caused by the pandemic. Episode 1 on motivation is live on the Inee website, and you can find it on Spotify as well. And episode 2 on early marriage launches this Friday. We really hope you'll listen. And then finally, we also have an ongoing blog series which invites EIE practitioners to share how they've adapted their girls' education programming during the COVID-19 pandemic. Please read and share, and please do feel free to reach out if you are interested in writing a blog for the series. We would love to share your lessons learned with our members. We hope that those resources are useful to you. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. That was great. And the recording will be available soon. So please look out for it on the website as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
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 Congratulations.